the continuing challenge of public safety is very, very high on our list. Boston, along with a few other cities around the country in the mid-90s, began to make what was regarded appropriately as astonishing promise in bringing levels of public safety back into what had been chaotic and crime-ridden neighborhoods. And that achievement was born of extraordinary partnerships between police and community and across jurisdictions, agencies, levels of government that really overcame historic tensions and insularity to show the country really how a city could be policed and how cooperation throughout the criminal justice system and importantly with the community what that could do, and it has been very widely emulated. But no achievement of this kind is permanent. It's inherently fragile, and one of the contributions we at the Boston Foundation are trying to make is to continue public focus and discourse on this set of issues, and very daunting challenges remain to all of us. We are very pleased to be joined in this series of forums by the Gardiner Howland Shaw Foundation and our partners MassINC and the Crime and Justice Institute. And together, I think we've put on a set of outstanding programs, and this one will be no exception. And there really is an all-star lineup that is ready to talk to you about these issues. But before we get into it and introduce the Lieutenant Governor, I'd like to bring Ian Bowles up. Ian is the new Director of MassINC. MassINC, as we all know, is a nonpartisan think tank committed to developing a public agenda that promotes the growth of and vitality of the middle class in Massachusetts. And Ian will introduce the Lieutenant Governor. Welcome, Ian.
Well, good morning, everyone. Let me also just ask everyone to give a round of applause for Paul Grogan and his leadership here at the Boston Foundation. I'm sure I don't need to tell everyone in the room, but few public safety issues affect the quality of life in Massachusetts more than crime. Through research, Commonwealth magazine, and public events like this here this morning, MassINC has tried to contribute to the public dialogue on how Massachusetts can be a place where all citizens can pursue the American dream without fear for their safety. And I'm pleased to join Paul and the Boston Foundation in welcoming our panel here this morning. We're going to have a lively discussion about the CHINS law and the pathways forward towards reforming it. And we've got a number of experts here, and because we've got a packed program, I'd ask everyone to look through their programs for backgrounds on each of the individual speakers. And I'm only going to introduce two here this morning. First, we have Molly Armstrong, who's come join us from the Vera Institute in New York. Molly runs the demonstration projects for the Vera Institute, which partners with governments around the nation. And she's going to give us a national perspective on the CHINS law, some of the background, what other states are doing in innovating in similar laws around the country. But before she comes up for me, I have the pleasure to introduce Carrie Healy, our Lieutenant Governor, here this morning. MassINC has had a tremendous opportunity to work together with the Lieutenant Governor. We're very proud to have her this morning. She brings extensive public policy experience to the Romney team. Previously, she worked for Apt Associates in the areas of law and public safety. She's currently chair of the Romney administration's Crime Commission. And she's someone who brings a long experience in this area to this work, so we're very lucky to have her here this morning to join us. So, without further ado, Lieutenant Governor of the Commonwealth, Carrie Healy.
Thank you, Ian. I'm really very pleased to be here this morning and to welcome you to this panel discussion on the CHINS laws. It's extremely important, and I'd also like to thank MassINC and the Boston Foundation for continually sponsoring forums of this type. They make such a contribution to the Commonwealth. We can't possibly do all this work ourselves. And we in government understand that in this time of constricted budgetary requirements, it is so important that the nonprofit sector and the public sector, the public sector work together so that we can come up with the right answers especially in critical areas like criminal justice. I'd also like to welcome Ian Bowles. I think we're all suffering from a little bit of lack of sleep because of the Red Sox last night. We are just, I have to tell you, I too felt like it was a little bit too early to get up this morning. Criminal justice does play such an important role in our lives, and as Ian mentioned, that is really what brought me into politics initially. I had been working in criminal justice, and in fact, I had the honor of working under Jeremy Travis, who came from the Vera Institute at the U.S. Department of Justice for a number of years. And the more and more I became involved with criminal justice policy, the more I felt that we could be doing better in the public sector and government, and that there were so many changes that were important to make that would genuinely affect our quality of life here in the Commonwealth and elsewhere. And so it moved me to get involved with the political process, which is, as you know, a very different world than the academic world, but one in which you hope you can get your message across perhaps a little bit more directly. And I can tell you that our administration is one that listens to the voices in the nonprofit world, in the academic world, and tries to take direction and tries to find the best policies and wants to implement the best policies that are coming out of your research. So I hope that that's an encouragement to you, and I am very anxious to see what comes out of this panel's discussion this morning. I'd also like to welcome the Chief Justice. It's wonderful to see you here this morning, and your participation is so important to this whole process. Each year, there are 14,000 CHINS petitions filed on behalf of parents and schools in the Commonwealth, and each of these is a testament to the fact that parents or schools have lost their ability to assert their authority over certain children. And these children are not necessarily criminals. I'm sure I'm not telling you anything you don't know already, but these are simply what is often called stubborn children, children who are truants, children who are runaways, children who are no longer able to be easily dealt with by the authority figures in their families. And since 1987, there have been no fewer than 4 commissions put together to look at this topic, to try to decide how might we better handle these children's, what is going on with the CHINS process, how might it be improved. Unfortunately, none of these reform efforts has been successful, and so this is still a topic that needs to be discussed. We need to take another look at it. We need to go back and ask these questions over again in our current context. As this panel meets today, I'd like to offer a few questions for discussion, and I'm sure that we will get answers to all of these before it's done. First is, we must ask parents and schools to move quickly to involve services and other resources to help children before they become involved with the courts. And how can we do this? How can we reform our CHINS laws, or how can we look at the process that occurs as children move towards using CHINS laws to emphasize the need for involving services before children reach the courts? Second, how can we ensure that the parents stay involved with this process? How can we make sure that a parent is required to actively seek to resolve the problems that led their children to be involved with a CHINS petition? And if indeed the parent loses custody of the child or gives up custody of the child for a time, how can we make sure that that's a short period of time and that all of our efforts are focused on reuniting that child and that family and resolving the issues that led to that loss of parental control? And secondly, how can we, or third actually, how can we ask the courts to help us reinforce the parents' responsibility to act responsibly toward their children, to take responsibility for controlling their children? This is something that the courts can play an important role in, and we don't ever want to see CHINS petitions used as an excuse for parents to walk away from their responsibility to their children. We'd rather see them as an opportunity to re-involve the parents constructively in that dialogue. And finally, what kind of data should we be collecting? Now, this is where I come back to me being a researcher. I always want to know what kind of data we should be collecting. But I think that it's very important that we ask our courts, DSS, all of our social service agencies to work together to start tracking CHINS children and try to find out what kind of data should we be collecting, what works, what doesn't work, and how can we reform the system to take into account what we know about these fragile children's lives. I think that the most important thing I can ask all of these panel members to do today is to figure out how to work together to solve this problem, that this is genuinely a system that needs to learn to work together, not only just to collect data, but to solve the issues in these children's lives. And it's a huge responsibility. I respect people who choose this field immensely, because working with children is the most important job that we have in society. So thank you so much for having me here today. I look forward to seeing the outcome of this panel discussion, and best of luck to you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carrie Healy. We're going to turn it over now to Molly Armstrong, and then Dana Ansell is going to come up and moderate the panel discussion. So thank you very much, Molly.
Well, good morning. I have to confess I stayed up last night as well. I'm not a huge baseball fan, but I really did want to know what the tone of the audience was going to be this morning. So I want to thank you all for having me. This is a subject that is very, very near and dear to my heart. I've actually been working with this population for almost 20 years now. And it's a tough population, but I am so impressed at the breadth of people in the room and the quality of the people on the panel, and in fact very impressed at your state. You have studied this problem more than almost any state I've seen, I have to say. So, and it's a pleasure actually to finally get to meet Lieutenant Governor Healy. Back when I started the Vera Institute, we were actually setting up an office in South Africa. And the writings that she had done back in the mid-'90s on witness intimidation were very important because I think, as many of you know, rape is an incredibly difficult problem in South Africa. And one of the problems is actually getting women to testify in rape cases. So that was very, very helpful. Thanks to the BostonFoundation, to MassINC, to Ian, to Dana, to the Gardiner Howland Shaw Foundation, and to the Crime and Justice Institute, and to Elise Clausen for having me. Okay, I always start by asking how many of you in the audience are currently raising a teenager? Okay. How many of you have survived that experience? There we go. Okay. And I start there because this is a population that all of us, I think, feel that we're familiar with. And I think when I looked at MassINC's charge, and particularly the charge of trying to bring issues that are particularly important to the middle class, this population, more in some ways than any other, is a population that I think resonates with us who have been parents or been siblings and have wondered about whether or not one of our children was going to survive adolescence. And the struggle with this population is trying to figure out what is normal adolescence, which is frustrating and difficult and testing and trying, right? And when does that cross some invisible line and become something where the kid is truly in danger, or the family has fractured, or the community is potentially going to suffer? And I think you can really see that when you look at the data, some of the data that exists in Massachusetts, because half of your children who come in through the CHINS system survive and go on and are not ever coming back into the juvenile justice or the criminal justice system. And that's the good news. And the bad news is about 54%, in some of the data that I saw, don't. And they do end up in the juvenile justice and the criminal justice system. Now, I want to inject one caution here. Your population is a little bit different than some of the other places where we've studied this issue. And it's different because it looks like about a quarter of your kids actually were in the juvenile justice system first. All right? So think about that, right? So they've already touched another system before they go into your CHINS system. And that should raise some questions in your mind. What is it about that first experience when they hit the juvenile justice system that people, the professionals, their folks, somebody decided that they actually needed to then go on to another system? They needed to turn to the CHINS system to get more help, a different kind of help, or something else. So it's an important pathway, yes, potentially into the criminal justice or juvenile justice system, but it's a little bit murky because some of them are already there. All right, so we're going to start with a definition of CHINS. The Lieutenant Governor referred to it. The way I think of it, there are actually 4 reasons, and I'm holding it up like this because 2 of those reasons are related to a kid's parent and their relationship with their parent, and 2 of those reasons are related to a kid's relationship with the school. Okay? And almost every state has some version of your CHINS law, Children in Need of Services. They have wonderful acronyms and wonderful, very old-fashioned language, actually. My favorite, I think, is Florida, which has the same words, Children in Need of Supervision, but they call it CHINS. So I think that's kind of appropriate. We call them PINs, Persons in Need of Supervision. And in Arizona, they use a very old-fashioned term. It's called incorrigibles. So in Massachusetts, how do you become a CHINS? Well, there are allegations on the parent side of 2 kinds. And the first is pretty self-explanatory. It's runaways, right? Kids who run away from home, usually chronically run away from home. And that's about, the data I saw, most of the data I'm going to cite in terms of numbers comes from a probation study that looked at data from the mid-'90s. So I don't have much that's more recent, so from like 94 to 97. So about 28% of the kids that come into the system come in as runaways. Your second person category, family category, I love. It's the stubborn children category. And I think some of us are probably squirming in our seat because we're thinking about our own children, and they sort of fit that category. But it's very specific, okay? And I'm going to read this so I don't get it wrong. It's a child who fails to obey the lawful and reasonable commands of their parent or guardian, resulting in the inability to adequately care and provide for that child. All right? And that's the bulk of your population. That's 40% of the kids who come into the system. Kids who come in because of an allegation involving their home, you're capped at 17. And that's distinguished from the kids who come in a school-related issue where your cap is at 16. Okay? And that's actually kind of unique. There's only about 5 states that cap at 16. So what are the 2 school reasons? Again, you have one self-explanatory and one that takes a little explanation. And the first is truancy, kids who are chronically truant, not attending school. And that's about 28.5% of your population, so you have another quarter. So for those of you who are really good at math and have already added up the percentages, you know there's only a little bit left. There's only about 5% left. And that's what's called your school offenders. And a lot of times you look past a population that was only 5% of your population. But this seems to be a particularly troubled part of your population. And the school offenders are kids who are getting into, they're breaking school laws and regulations, usually on some kind of a regular basis. Some of their behavior might even be already characterized as delinquent behavior. And in fact, when you look at the breakdowns in the data, they're more likely to have already touched the delinquency system, and they are much more likely to actually end up later in the juvenile justice and criminal justice system. So why am I making such a big deal about these 4 distinctions, besides the fact that CHINS is not a self-explanatory law? And that is because I think it is incredibly important to realize it is an umbrella term. And in fact, we collect a large group of kids and families under this umbrella term, and they are not the same. And I think the jurisdictions that have addressed this problem the most successfully have actually come up with programs that pay attention to the distinctions, and they look at where the truancy is the predominant issue, they address the issue of truancy. And where the family and the breakdown in the family is the predominant issue, they focus on that issue. And so I would urge you, as you continue to wrestle admirably with this issue, that you think about what the distinctions are between these populations. All right, so the Lieutenant Governor gave you some global numbers. Another thing I would urge you is actually what we found is things vary tremendously from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And so the breakdowns I gave you, which were also aggregate figures, probably vary. They may be slightly different in Boston. And they're probably different in different suburban and rural parts of the state. But one of the things that's really cool about this issue is that everybody, the old urban, suburban, rural breakdowns that we get into a lot of discussions about don't apply with the status offender population, which is the global term for CHINS and PINS. And that's because whether you're in a small jurisdiction, you have just a couple of kids, these kids can wreak a lot of havoc, pull a lot of adult attention to them, and they're very expensive. If they get detained or placed, you're looking, I think the average cost I saw was about $52,000 for a placement, and it can go up from there. I mean, and easily you could break a small jurisdiction's budget by just a couple of placements, $50,000, $100,000, and before you're looking at it, you've broken the budget for the year. So there are partnerships that can actually be formed between jurisdictions, and New York City's learned a lot, for example, from a very small county upstate. We unfortunately normally turn up our nose at small counties upstate. But there's a small county called Cattaraugus County, which is a little bit east of Buffalo. And they've done some incredibly creative work where they looked actually at their budget, and their detention and placement numbers were going through the roof with this population. And they started a very intensive program where they pulled together the parents and the probation officers and the school and the courts and did a very, very quick intervention with parents. The weekend after parents present, they take them away on a retreat, and they've been able to keep a lot of the parents and families together and really reduce their detention and placement population. So I think if you look around the state, there are probably examples here. There are probably examples right here in Boston of people who are doing really good work with this population, so I'd urge you to do that. Quick recounting of what are the complaints. Well, one could go on for quite some time about what the complaints are with the system. The obvious one, of course, is the recidivism rate and the fact that half of your kids do end up in the criminal justice and juvenile justice system. But I'd also tell you that there's really low consumer satisfaction. Parents and kids are actually not very happy with this system. They complain about the services. They complain the services are inconvenient. They happen at times that are inconvenient, that they're not convenient physically in terms of a physical location. They complain about kids are not very interested in going to a mental health clinic that actually says mental health clinic on the outside. Very hard to get them to walk in, and yet the incidence of mental health disturbances in this population is very, very high. Depression, a huge problem with this population. And the parents complain that they actually, in many cases, were the ones who brought the petition. They are interested in getting help for their children, and yet they feel like in some ways they become the enemy when they walk in the door and they're being judged constantly. The professionals complain. They complain about each other a lot. All right? We talk about it being a system. It's not really a system at all. It's a loose collection of agencies: probation, mental health, the courts, social services. The reason the data isn't very good is, I mean, we all have our dark, dirty secrets, and a lot of times our own data isn't very good, much less data that goes across systems. And these kids, more than any other population, just spread out across systems. They're different from a delinquency population. There is an overlap, as we talked about, but we're talking about chronic issues. And so, for example, when the courts struggle with this issue, it's not about a factual dispute. It's rarely, you can almost always come up with a reason that a kid would meet the definition of a CHINS. It's about a chronic problem that's been going on for some time, and then a crisis happens, either on the school side or the family side, and that family or school wants immediate satisfaction. And that's one of the things we struggle with the most, is because they want immediate satisfaction, and yet our processes often take a lot of time. There's a lot of delay. There's a lot of waiting lists for services. Complaint that things are too kid-centered, that we split up kids from their families, and we may do a lot of sort of peer-oriented stuff, but in fact the problem really rests in the home, and that kid is going to go home, whether it's tomorrow or 2 years from now or 5 years from now. And so the need to really bring the family into the process. Poor data is an ongoing complaint, as the Lieutenant Governor alluded to. So, quick list of places that have sort of tackled this issue and things they've done. You have to think about whether any of these work for your jurisdiction. First thing is quick. Being quick is really, really important. And so the jurisdictions who have responded most successfully to this have solutions that can take place virtually within 24/7. So you take Illinois. Illinois really wrestled with this question. They did a big study back in 1981, and they found that this population was absolutely draining their court time and draining placement resources. And they took a pretty radical step, and that may not be a step for you guys. And they severely restricted access by law They restricted placement entirely for truancy cases, and they decided to make it much, much harder and mandate diversion services for their incorrigible population, their stubborn children population. So what happens? Literally, a parent goes to a precinct, they file a complaint about their kid, a counselor goes to that precinct, and they are mandated within a certain amount of time. They have to be there within 2 hours, and the solution is very, very quick. In San Francisco, the Huckleberry House, which is a great name, a parent can come and they can get immediate counseling. If the family breakdown is such that things are really in dire straits, and they can actually leave the child there, but the average length of stay is only 3 days. 3 days. And they are able to serve the entire city of San Francisco, which is about 700,000 people, with about a 6-bed facility. Why? Because what they find is that a lot of times what people need is just a quick cooling off period, and then they have very intensive family mediation and family counseling. But they on purpose do not want to separate the kid and the family for very long, because they don't want people to get comfortable being separated, and they want them to emphasize that the responsibility still rests with the parent to take care of their child. So quick is very important. Strategic use of resources. All right, you really have to think about this. And when Dana and I were talking about this before I came up, there's always a debate about whether we can use more resources. And I think particularly now that request often falls on deaf ears. But what we found is this system. You guys are building an aqueduct, is what I understand, right? And it's a problem because the current aqueduct is leaking like all kinds of water before it ever gets to the city. You're losing about 40% of your water. This system is like that aqueduct, and it leaks kids and families, but it also leaks money all over the place. And part of the challenge, I think, is to really try to get your data together and look at how you're spending your money on detention and placement. There are kids who, unfortunately, for their own sake and their own safety, do need to be removed from the home. But you really need to examine whether some of those kids could, in fact, stay at home or go home more quickly, because it's basically a 10-to-1 ratio. It costs about 10 times as much to have that kid in a residential setting than it would to place that kid to provide preventive services in the first place. So look at how you're distributing your resources. Your data can be really, really helpful here. And don't get complicated about this. I mean, we've all lived in jurisdictions where they've spent millions of dollars building really fancy relational databases, and I'm a big fan of them. And AJ Cashew, who's here, who did a lot of the work, where, it's wonderful when you have lots and lots of administrative data, but an Excel spreadsheet would do, Just track a few of your kids and see where they're going and see how you're spending your dollars, and I think you'll be able to find that some of them could probably stay for shorter periods of time. The multi-agency thing. You guys are famous for your partnerships, and this is one where I cannot urge enough that you figure out a way. Think of it as a poker game. It is really in everybody's self-interest to sit at a table, because everybody feels burdened by this population. Everybody has complaints about everybody else. It's sort of that hot potato. We complain that we're passing that kid around. We're passing from the delinquency system to the social services to the court. And so it's really, really important, and in a very concrete, quick way to get people together. And I mean that on the policy level, the level of the people that are sitting on this panel, but the most successful jurisdiction, Syracuse, has a panel that gets together those kids who they can't immediately return home, school, police, social services, probation, the court. They sit in a room, they know that kid, they share the information, and they make a very a joint decision about what they're going to do in terms of placement for that child. And everybody is on the same page. And they have brought down their placement rates dramatically, and they've brought down their recidivism rates. And a lot of the stuff you read that's come out in the last 5 years has suggested that it has to be about that. It has to be about taking that kid in context, working with the family. So all the acronyms, the MSTs, the FFTs, the OSLCs that have been shown to work have worked in a comprehensive way with a kid, because you can't take the kid out of the school. You have to work with the school. You can't take the kid out of the community. You have to work all together. And it has to be family oriented. You can't do it with just the kid. You really can't do it with just the kid. It has to be respectful. You have to think in a sort of consumer marketing way, which we're not really accustomed to doing in our systems because we don't tend to think of the kids and the parents as the consumers of that system. But it's about engagement, right? And how do you engage those parents so that they want to stay involved? And what they're telling us when they walk away is that they're not satisfied in some way with that system. Now, some of that is about unrealistic expectations, and you have to spend some time on that. And but what do parents want? Well, the acronym I always think of is SAD. It's a good acronym for this population. So that what they want is they want services, they want authority, but they want their authority. And when they go to a judge, what they're really looking for, they're not looking for the judge to become the authority. They want the judge to bolster their authority, right? And they're looking for discipline. And that's the trickiest one of all, because what you hear most often, I mean, I was sitting on the train, is they want a boot camp. And, you know, it's not usually a good moment to suggest that the research on the boot camps is actually not very good, right? But they want what a lot of they want a military high school, or they want, some parents would send their kids away to a certain kind of prep school if they had the resources. They're looking for structure. And part of what we have to do is to help give them that structure, but teach them, in fact, how they can do that in the home, if the home can support that. And I'll tell you that our experience has been that you can have really good results. We've seen counties in New York that have done it. I think there are parts of Illinois that have done a terrific, terrific job. Arizona, Maricopa County, Phoenix, unbelievable. They created a special truancy program. It's called CUTS. I can't remember exactly this moment what it stands for. Probation officers in the school with the highest truancy rates for truancy petitions. They do a hearing within a week. They do a contract with the parent and the kid. Attendance has gone up. In that population, 97% of the kids' attendance goes up after these hearings. Compliance with the contracts is about 75%, which is phenomenal, phenomenal. And the 4-year graduation rate has improved by about 14%. And most importantly, what the teachers and the administrators in those schools have observed is that they see lower incidences, lower levels of fighting, lower levels of drug use in that school. Not a lot of resources. They have about 5 probation officers for a city that's now about to be the 5th largest city in the United States. So we're not talking, I think, about a tremendous amount of resources. We're talking about creative use of resources, but most of all, we're talking about the adults talking to each other. And I think if you can do that, you'll find a system that the kids like a lot better, the parents like a lot better, and the professionals that work in it, who really struggle in it, valiantly struggle in it, will like a lot better. And the community will like it a lot better because you'll see lower recidivism rates. So thanks again for having me. And I'll be around for any questions afterwards.
That was great. Thank you, Molly. Come in. Everyone come in. There's a lot of seats up front. So let me introduce briefly the panelists. Starting from my right is Officer Neva Grice. Seated next to her is Attorney Patricia Wynn. Then we have Commissioner Harry Spence. Next to him is Chief Justice Martha Grace. Next to her is Aubrey, who's a representative from the Massachusetts Families for Kids Speak Out team. And I refer you to their programs if you want to learn more about their impressive backgrounds. Also, when you sat down on your chair today, there were 2 things. There was a program and there was an index card. The index card is there in case you want to ask any questions. If you would, I would ask you to direct it to a specific panelist and to identify yourself. And in about a half hour or so, we'll collect those index cards, and then we'll have an opportunity to pose those questions to the panelists. So let's begin. I think Molly helped us understand the sort of, what CHINS is and what some of the key factors to success are, and also why the law is important. And I'd like to sort of pick up on that and turn to Commissioner Spence. You've been very vocal in talking about the importance of this law and why we need change. And I'd like you to help us understand today why you think the law is so important.
Well, I think the law, I actually would start by taking from Robert Kinscherf, who works with Justice Grace, Judge Grace, who is the head of the court clinic, and he says, poke a CHINS kid and anything can come out. By which I think he means exactly what Molly was saying. This is an immense catch-all. And the second thing that's fascinating about this collection, this sort of umbrella under which we collect adolescents and latency age kids, is how do you define who they are? Well, somebody said to me early on a wonderful statement, what's the definition of crisis for a kid? The definition of crisis is when the adults can't cope anymore. It's not that the kid crosses a boundary, the adults cross a boundary. It's a crisis when the adults can't handle it anymore. So this notion, for example, about speed and time, these are all of the kids, or a very large portion of the kids, that are posing a huge crisis for the adults in the community. And those kids, for their own sake, need attention because when the adults reach that point, something serious is going to happen if there's not an intervention. So the kids are hugely at risk, both because of their own behavior and because of the adults' incapacity to respond. And the adults are now at risk. I'd add another thing, which is I think we need to remember that in most cases, CHINS kids have siblings. And the crisis in the family isn't just a crisis for that adolescent. It's a crisis for the entire family, and it's affecting every child in that family. And so our failure to respond effectively, to these cases, simply the cost of that failure is enormous. I think my own belief is the CHINS statute in Massachusetts, I believe it was the first such statute in the country. I think Massachusetts, under the famous and infamous, this is the problem with being 57, Jerry Miller, I think created the first CHINS statute. I may be wrong about that, but close, early on. And we have not done any work. This is a sort of a struggle. We went through a huge period of reform in the 70s, and then we sat and left things the same, and we've made no changes since. So I think we've discovered, and 4 commissions have documented, all the failures of that system, and we've done nothing as a Commonwealth formally to respond to those failures that are so widely acknowledged, and to say, let's take our learning and do far better by these children and families. And I think it's urgent that we do so.
Thank you. Now I'd like to turn to Aubrey, and thank you for coming and being willing to talk about your own experiences. I should add, as Molly mentioned, half of the children have some involvement with the criminal system after a CHINS petition, and half don't. Just to be clear, Aubrey is one of the half who didn't. And I think her experiences today can help sort of enlighten our conversation. Aubrey, can you tell us a little bit about your own experiences, and based on that, what would you do to change the system to make it work better for other youth?
Okay, so my name is Aubrey Esters. I became involved with CHINS when I was 16. My parents filed a stubborn child CHINS or whatever, and it was for I went out to a party and didn't come home until 2 in the morning or something, and I lit candle in the house, and silly things like that, and that I feel that they needed to file a stubborn child. And it was also, the main reason was because I'm transsexual, and that's something they can't handle as adults, as parents or trying to be parents. So, so that was originally the reason why the CHINS was filed. It failed in the first time. They filed another one, and I said, you know what, I'd rather be in DSS. I don't want to live in your house anymore anyways. It wasn't working out. So I think I'm the only person I've ever met who's requested to be put in DSS. I'm not? Okay. That's good. Okay. Yeah, and the CHINS, I really didn't understand like what CHINS was, and I still completely really don't understand. I think that's a flaw, is that a lot of the people I've talked to people like since I like after I knew that I was coming here to speak, I was asking people I knew. I was like, do you know what CHINS is? Blah blah blah, and they were like, oh yeah, CHINS, and like some people were like certain that all CHINS was getting like something strapped on your ankle so you couldn't leave the house, and that's what they thought it was. Like that was like the name of it or something. And so people like people that are in the system don't understand what it is, and I think that's a real big problem because if people aren't understanding it, then it's really not doing any good for anyone. And I went like through the system. Like I had a probation worker lady, and which wasn't a very good experience. She actually decided to share her religious views with my parents and vice versa, and so they were all buddies, like, oh great, we're both Christians, that's awesome, you know. So and so it was a pretty interesting experience. I don't know how that happened, or if that's supposed to be happening or not. And that kind of tainted the entire way that my CHINS case moved, because she had this already biased perspective on the situation, and she wasn't really interested in, in my opinion, I don't think she was interested in seeing me where I needed to go. Instead, she wanted to appease my parents and have them feel that they're doing the right thing. So I went through there. I showed up every 3 months of the CHINS hearings. It wasn't really much. I just didn't get it. I didn't understand like what the whole thing was about. I was in DSS, and I mean, it was an interesting situation. Also, I mean, I went from one emotionally abusive placement to another one equally or more abusive emotionally placement. So I think that has a lot of problems. So I don't think we're here to talk about DSS today. But yeah. Another experience that I had with CHINS, well, yeah, two more. One more was that being like, after I was like medically diagnosed with gender identity disorder and gender dysphoria, the required treatment procedure for that is to begin hormone replacement therapy, and I wasn't allowed to, and so I went to the CHINS. I got the Gardiner Howland. That whole thing, I don't really understand either what they do, because they didn't do much until I called them 17 times, and he was supposed to research it and bring it to court and just try to prove to the judge why it was important and it was a medical disorder, and the only possible treatment was the hormone replacement therapy. He didn't do his research correctly. He didn't represent me at all, which was interesting. He represented his own beliefs and his own views, and that was of my parents, and didn't even bother to contact mental health professionals that were involved with me. So I think there needs to be a lot of background, there needs to be checking to see where the people that are involved in the CHINS cases, what they're actually doing and who they're actually helping, whether they're helping, the parents or the child, and what the actual goal of the whole procedure is. And another experience I have with CHINS, I never did anything I wasn't in trouble legally or whatever, but still, after I turned 18, I went to the court to try to get my name changed, and CHINS was there under when they did a criminal record check. So that was something very surprising. I didn't know I was a criminal, and all of a sudden they said, well, you can't get your name changed because you have a criminal record. So I eventually got it cleared up, but that's something that I didn't know about. I don't know if anyone else knew about that. That it's on your criminal record once you're in it, even if you haven't done anything that is deserving of it. So those are my thoughts right now.
And Chief Justice, how well do you think the law is working, and what would you do to improve it?
Thank you. Well, in the spirit of full disclosure, I must tell you that when Ms. Ansell called me about this, it was several months ago, and I responded and said, yes, I was available and happy to come. I did not know at the time it was a forum to sort of dismantle the CHINS law, and had I known, maybe I might have made a different decision about my attendance. But I feel so strongly about it that I probably would have decided to come. So I have many thoughts about what Molly Armstrong said, as well as about what the Lieutenant Governor said. I will tell you at the start that I think the most effective and efficient way to make use of our scarce resources is to identify the problems early that kids have. Nowhere is it more important than through the use of our specially trained juvenile probation officers. There are some of them, the chief probation officers are here today. It is through their work that we have been able to identify problems early in the process. Now, what do we do about them? Well, I have to tell you, I give all kinds of credit to Maricopa County, but as long as I've been a judge, that's 13 years, we've had probation officers full-time in the schools. Yeah, they do cut down truancies. They do cut down problems. There's earlier identification of problems. Why don't we have them in all schools? We just don't have the resources. But they are a very effective tool, and we've been doing that for a long time. I also have to say, I don't know the experience of everybody in the panel, but as a judge for 13 years, I've been the one sitting in the seat. I've handled hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of CHINS cases myself permanently. I know how effective these cases can be. As far as parents' expectations and low consumer satisfaction, I've had lots of parents say to me, you know, you've had my kid in court for 3 months and you haven't done anything. And I say, yeah, but you had him for the first 14 years. Could we flip that around? We'll take him for 14 years. You can have him when he becomes kind of an errant teenager. There's a lot of expectation. I think Aubrey mentioned something. First of all, Aubrey's having had a CHINS filed on her at age 16 is very unusual. Most of the time, the CHINS come to us much earlier. By 16, it's difficult for us to figure a lot of stuff out because they're going to age out of our system fairly soon. But I think parents come, as someone said recently at a CHINS conference, CHINS are filed in our court primarily by parents when they have no place else to go, when they've exhausted all the resources that they think are available to them in the community. To not have that leaves a void. If we were to dismantle the CHINS law tomorrow, does anybody really think all the teenagers would read that, or read the repeal and say, well, okay, I'm not going to misbehave? Our director of court clinics that the commissioner mentioned, Robert Kinshirf, and I quote him, always says, you know, if we walk outside right now and we see a mentally ill, substance abusing, 24-year-old homeless man in the street, we're going to find a place for him because it offends our sensibilities to see him lying in the street. But we have already met him. We met him when he was 20. We met him when he was 16. We met him when he was 12. We met him when he was 9. We probably took him away from an abusive family when he was 3. Our failure to intervene early as possible is what leads to that. We have an opportunity. It's very difficult to measure prevention. CHINS don't fall into one category, and I think it was Molly who said it. It's not one size fits all. It's incapable of the easy boundaries in a delinquency, a criminal charge. You have a complaint either by summons or arrest. You have a pretrial conference. You have a plea or a trial, and you have a disposition. Boom, that's the end of the case. They fit into a neat box, just like if someone breaks their leg, you know it's going to take approximately 6 or 12 weeks to repair. But with so many of the CHINS cases, they don't fall into these boxes. Robert Kinshirf also said it, you tap a CHINS kid and a million things fly out. It's like an iceberg. Most of them, or many of them, come with seemingly benign issues, kids running away from home. Are they running away because mom is making them come in at 8 o'clock at night when they think midnight is a good curfew? She doesn't let them use the phone. They, God forbid, have to do chores like, cleaning their room. I always ask the kids, well, is your room clean today? Yeah. Can you see the floor of it? Well, I can see a path to my bed. It's not about cleaning their rooms. I had a child at one point when mom, he was picked up with 48 bags of cocaine, but the mom was saying he doesn't clean his room, he doesn't do his chores, he doesn't come in the curfew, and I found 6 cat heads in his room today. And I will tell you what was the most disturbing thing about it was hearing all of these things said the same way, as if not emptying the dishwasher was on the same level as the 6 cat heads. And anybody who's been in this field knows how dangerous it is. When you take a runaway, is a kid running away because of curfews? Or, as kids have told us, and it's one of the reasons that I constantly oppose opening the courtrooms, because when I hear what I'm about to tell you in the courtroom, I am reminded every time that I wouldn't hear it otherwise. Why are you running away? I've asked innocently. Because mom's boyfriend comes into my bedroom every night. That's not an isolated case. It's at that moment that the whole nature of the case changes. This is not a benign runaway. This is a kid who needs to be removed from the home. We need to find a place for it. This is a kid severely traumatized, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. But this is a mom who brought the child in. Half of our, not half, I don't know statistically, but a good number of our CHINS cases are really hybrid care and protections. But when they're teenagers and the mother's working with the family, we don't file a termination, a C&P. But if we did, because there were no CHINS cases, then the cost to the Commonwealth of handling this as a care and protection case would be far greater. I've had a young lady tell me, well, I run away, but then I come back about 10 o'clock at night, and I stay underneath the porch until I'm sure my stepfather or boyfriend or whatever it is sound asleep before I come in. And there was an enormity of problems that we see. There are some court clinicians here today. Most of our court clinic referrals are through CHINS cases. It is where we have identified the most serious mental health issues. Now, all of you who had teenagers, you had them when they were little, and I just got through from 3 days of caring for an 18-month-old. My granddaughter. It was wonderful and fun and exhausting. But you know what? It's not nearly as hard as caring for a teenager. And I remember that because, obviously, to have grandchildren, you go through teenage years. That's sort of the payoff, the payback, nice time that you get. But the mental illness cases need to be addressed. Those problems aren't going to go away untreated. They're simply going to go on. They're going to cost more in the long run. What we fail to do for kids today, we're going to pay for later. It's the hardest thing legislatively to make. The hardest argument is to say a pay now, a pay later system. Now, the Commissioner and I, believe it or not, even though I don't agree with him that we haven't responded, we talk frequently. We do agree on the data collection. There is no more critical need than getting accurate data, so that what we're not talking about is anecdotes. I mean, I have anecdotal information from my years of being on the bench and hearing hundreds of these cases. I would love to have a population study that says, who are these kids? Where are they coming from? What kinds of background are they coming from? I think those are the sort of my initial thoughts. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, and I don't know that we are here to talk about dismantling the law. I think we all have an interest in talking about how it can be better, and hopefully we can make some steps forward in improving
we can think about changes that include more responsibility for parents. We can think about changes that contemporize it or modernize it, that recognize a changing structure of the family. We're all concerned about family values. We get a lot of kids today that are seeing very different things. They're growing up under very sort of different environments that they ever had before, with different kinds of pressures on them. But we cannot look at the child in his or her vacuum. When we send them home, whether it's a short time or a longer period of time, they're going back into the environment that spawned them. We need to do something about getting buy-in from the families. I'm all for shorter periods of time or limited placements under one condition. What that kid needs must be available today in the community if I don't want to take him out. If he needs mental health, you cannot say to him it's a 6-month or a 3-month wait. We as adults would not think of taking from a hospital when we brought our child in for a broken leg or a ruptured appendix, gee, I'm sorry, we can't do this for 6 months or 3 months. but yet we routinely tell families that there's a 3 or 6 month waiting period for mental health services. The last time I looked, the head was part of the body. Let's treat it that way.
Now, I want to turn to Attorney Wynn. When a CHINS petition is filed, a public defender is assigned to work with the youth. What's the biggest challenge for the public defenders who work with CHINS youth, and how would you improve the law?
The attorneys who take the CHINS cases, the role of the attorney in that case is to protect the child's interest, to keep the child free from unwarranted state intervention. And that's a legal construct that we teach lawyers, and that's what we expect lawyers to bring to the system. The challenge for lawyers in the system is to break out of that legal construct, because the CHINS case, as we all know, is about improving the life of the child. And the lawyer in that context needs to really think about the whole child. We've had a lot of discussion about the whole child. And that's a challenge for lawyers. We're not trained to do that. And so that's one of the challenges to lawyers in the system. The challenge to us as an agency at the Committee for Public Counsel Services is to train and teach lawyers how to handle CHINS cases, how to look at the child, look at the development issues that are really the focus of the CHINS cases, and to give those issues supremacy in how they address the child's needs. One thing that struck me that Aubrey said is teens don't understand the system, parents don't understand the system, and that is a critical failure when you have a client who's either before a judge or being addressed by a lawyer who doesn't understand why they're there. And one of the reasons why I think kids' parents don't understand why they're there is because the law itself is quite confusing. CHINS come before the court because of certain behaviors. And the idea for many is to, how do I get the child to stop doing that? And do I punish the child to get the child to stop doing that? Do I exercise the authority of the court to get the child to stop doing that? And that's one way of looking at it. Or do we look at what the goal of the CHINS statute is, and that is to improve the life of the child and to keep the child from moving from the CHINS case to a delinquency case, in which case you need to switch this whole framework around from stopping behavior to looking at what's going to make a child succeed. And that's a whole a change in the mindset of all of us who deal with CHINS cases to get us to stop looking at whether we can just fit the child into a box and have them behave the way we want them to behave, not understanding that we need to not so much look at the deficits that kids come to us with, and that's one of the things that I think we all have a problem with is that the kids, they'll have a number of evaluations, and the evaluations will say to the child, this is wrong with you, that's wrong with you, that's wrong with you, that's wrong with you, and so that the kid, a lot of issues that the child has with lack of self-esteem, with not feeling successful, get reinforced in the process that we force the child to go through in the CHINS system. So I think one of the challenges is how do we turn that around, and how do we start looking at what makes kids succeed? How do we start to figure out how we can get them to build self-esteem, to have positive outcomes in their lives, and so that we can really help them in the transition that they're in from childhood to adulthood.
And Officer Grice, I want to look now at sort of the connection between CHINS and juvenile crime, which is not the case for all the youth, but it certainly is a common outcome. And I want to ask you, do we know, work as a police officer, you work with youth. Do we know what works in terms of preventing juvenile crime? And what do you see the role of the CHINS law in helping to prevent juvenile crime?
Well, I don't think we know exactly what works in solving juvenile crime, but I think we know, particularly in Boston, what helps in solving juvenile crime. I think one of the things that Boston is pretty much known for is for its collaborations. But I think what goes deeper in Boston is its partnerships and actual relationships. Sometimes I make a joke, I have a lot of people on speed dial. That's literally true. I think the collaborations with the courts, with the DYS, with the schools, and with police officers working together as a resource. That's what I think I see CHINS as. I have so many different stories of hands-on stories of dealing with young people. Not only am I a police officer, but I'm also a concerned citizen in a community that works hands-on with young people. And one of the things that parents deal with is the lack of resources, immediate, consistent resources that deal primarily in the home. One of the things I realized one day we were doing, another program we have in the city is we go out with ministers, police officers, probation officers, school police, and concerned ministers and laity in the community. And we go into the homes, and as the justice said earlier, it's a problem with not only just washing the dishes, but then having crack in your pocket at 9 years old. What does a parent do then? What resources does a police officer have as a first responder to offer to that parent? I think the CHINS is a very direct and specific resource, and a collaboration between in the city of Boston. One thing also we have to realize is that the stereotype associated with the CHINS in Boston, particularly in the black community, is kind of, they don't want DYS or DSS into the home per se, even in a long-term process. But I think education within the CHINS process to not only police officers, to families in the community, that this can be a good relationship. This can allow a child that is in the 12th grade but may have a 5th grade reading level. Maybe that's why he's not going to school, and the mother won't be able to deal with him. So now he's not going to school, maybe he's not coming home, and then maybe he's associating with some negative crowds and maybe gang involved or maybe even gang associated, which in my business is just as worse. A lot of different things can come in play. One of the things I realized with CHINS as a officer working in the district is that with officers, that it kind of holds a stereotype, because you don't want to kind of take that child out of the home. You don't want to have that definite process. But I think through education and having officers understand that this is a partnership that we're going to form, and it's going to be a support with later on with the resources that are involved with the CHINS process. I think it will be a valuable resource.
Thanks. And the police are one of the sort of 3 entities, along with the parents and the schools, that can file a CHINS petition.
Yes.
Can you sort of quickly tell sort of what triggers the Boston police to decide to file a CHINS petition?
Primarily it's the parent's request. Once you, as a first responder, you're going to go into the home, and the parent will probably request that, and through an interview in that home, a CHINS can be filed from that officer after a supervisor responds to the scene. Certain issues that may trigger it is, one, the child hasn't gone to school, refuses to go to school, the child hasn't come home. I'm not going to say a runaway, but maybe he's been out of the home for a couple of days. The mother may even know where the child is. He may be down the street at a neighbor's house staying there, but she doesn't want to file criminal procedures on the neighbor because the child is just staying there. But she wants the child home, and she can't really, bring the child home. And there hasn't been any kind of legal action against the family because of that. So a CHINS may be maybe a reason for that. Then it may be just as severe as was mentioned earlier, that there is some type of abuse, physical, mental, sexual abuse going on in the home, in which a CHINS may have to be filed to remove that child immediately from the home. So there's a number of different reasons why a police officer would do it. like I said, working with police officers on the street and dealing with youth on a day-to-day basis, some officers are a little reluctant to file a CHINS because they feel it's so permanent. It's so, you know, just the whole stereotype of dealing with DYS, that it's so negative, kind of. But I think through education and through support, I think we can pretty much eliminate that.
Thanks. Now, Commissioner Spence, I think we've all agreed and, you know, seen the importance of the CHINS law. I think, you know, we can all agree that if possible, and it seems like it could be, we'd like it improved. Do you think there's general agreement on how to improve it? And sort of, if so, what is that? Or do you think, yes, we'd like it improved, but there are sort of differences of opinions on how we would improve it?
I've not yet met anyone who doesn't agree that a greater focus on family in the law would be helpful, that I know of. That the concept that a parent can say to the court, "I'm done with this child," is a concept that's troubling, and that the response of the state should be, "No, but we're going to help you." And for me, that as I listened to all of our conversation this morning, I think that's the core value that's missing in the law, and that would undergird any set of changes one wants to make. I think the second agreement is that there is a need for the court to ensure, from my view actually, and I don't know whether there's full agreement on this, to ensure that if the adults fail in their responsibilities in this process, whether the adults are the parents or DSS or the local agencies or the mental health system that says wait 6 months, that the courts needed to corral the adults to ensure their participation in this process. I think there is agreement that we want to limit removal and reduce removal. That's part of a family-based system, that we want to reduce removal only to those cases where it's absolutely assured. The judge and I have talked about truancy cases, for example, and whether it's appropriate to remove a child in a truancy case. Presumably only if there are lots of other things going on that suggest that. So I think there are broad outlines of agreement. I just want to clarify, when I said 4 commissions and we haven't responded, I didn't mean we hadn't responded administratively. I meant we haven't changed the law. And all 4 commissions said change the law. So I'm talking about the response of the body politic, not of all of us who work in the administration.
All 4 commissions also outlined the need for more services to these kids in a more timely manner.
Right. That's true too. And that's all part of a system that would respond. I think it would be sad, though, if we concluded that if we aren't going to do everything, we shouldn't do anything. So the question really is, what are the steps we need to take and take simultaneously? The other thing I think we know, this is the last piece, we spend about $65,000 a year, I think is our number, for residential placements for 1,000 CHINS kids. I agree with the judge entirely. If we could do much earlier and more effective intervention, I think we could dramatically reduce the need for those later residential placements. And my biggest fear about CHINS is the number of kids who age out of placement that we create through this system. When one talks about the failure of the child welfare system, the biggest failure is the number of kids who age out. Kids who age out, who turn 18 with no adult set of adult relationships to support them as they move forward. And CHINS is the process, because it deals with adolescence, where that most frequently occurs. So if we can find ways to reduce the number of kids aging out, and it may require more services, it certainly should require moving the dollars up front to address them in a more constructive way earlier on, and it certainly requires a major focus on family and community. I think those are broad principles that I've not yet found anyone to say, no, that's a bad idea. Kids should be treated in isolation. So I think there is considerable agreement.
Do the other panelists agree with what Commissioner Spence is sort of laying out as some general principles?
We have a lot of areas, believe it or not, this panel notwithstanding, that we agree on, and we've talked a lot about them. One of the things that you should know is that the commissions, the previous commissions, have struggled with the issues of how to make parents more accountable. Sometime in the late 1970s, the CHINS statute was decriminalized federally, which meant, and you can still see vestiges of it in the present CHINS statute that calls for the right to a jury trial, if the merits of the petition are proved beyond a reasonable doubt. Beyond a reasonable doubt, a jury trial are what we associate with criminal terms. Those are vestiges that were never removed when the CHINS statute was originally drafted. It was a criminal statute. So the question is, if we make parents accountable, and I think there's a big, I'm not saying by way of discussing this that we shouldn't have a greater role for parents at all. There's no question. I completely agree with the Commissioner. When a parent comes in and says, here's my child, I'm done, I can't do anything with them, we have to say, no, wait a minute, you need to take them home. We'll take them for a couple of days, we'll do respite, but you need to step up to the plate. The question we have struggled with in a great deal is, what do you do when the parent doesn't comply? Well, the answer may be that we need to file a care and protection petition against that parent who is unwilling to be part of the process. But make no mistake about it, the costs of a care and protection petition in the court, the cost to the CPCS in terms of private counsel is much greater than a CHINS petition. So we have to figure out a way that when parents come to court, they understand that they are going to have to be accountable and part of the process. Some have opined that this may reduce the parents' willingness to come to court. Now, I have talked to the Commissioner, I have had discussions, and I said, let's try a pilot in one area on file truancies and say, we, the court, will agree not to commit a kid to the Department of Social Services on file truancies, assuming a truancy qua truancy. That is, there are no other mental health issues or other issues that we have identified, and frankly, again, we identify them primarily through the work of the juvenile probation offices. And if that is so identified, then as just a straight truancy, we will work with the family, but we need to have the services available that family needs. I mean, it's fairly simple, but I'm more than willing to try it and see if it works.
So
I would add on the issue of getting parents involved in the CHINS cases. There's another danger that I think the Judge pointed out, one of the risks. Another risk of having parents, and I think we all think that families need to be the subject of this intervention and this opportunity to intervene in the lives of children. If the parents are in court and it's decided that the parents have a lawyer and the children have a lawyer, one of the risks that we'd have to work through, and one of the dangers that we'd have to work through, is having the children and the parents be in an adversarial relationship through this process, building places in this process where the children and the parents are at odds with each other. And that's not moving the system forward, that's moving the system backwards. That could happen by the court taking action against the parent, and the parent feeling that the child is the real reason why the court's taking action against the parent, and you're building tension between the parent and the child. There's also there have been suggestions about fining parents for their inability to get children to attend school and increasing that fine. And these are all things that I think in isolation sound like they might introduce some accountability into the system, but I think they do so at the risk of creating greater tension between parents and children.
Do you have time for one last quick question? What it seems to me might be worth looking at or thinking about, and this is just an idea, is really, I think a great deal of behavior around this is built around issues of expectation. And if there were a clear process with clear expectations, I think you'd get a much higher level of compliance. And then there'll be lots of exceptions where there won't be compliance. But a clear process with clear expectations helps a great deal in shaping behavior.
You're talking about specifically with the CHINS
With
law.
families, with the CHINS law. So
Uh-huh.
if it's a very confused law under which some wonderful things occur, but also lots of things don't occur. And the question is, can we create a model that says this is what we wish would occur, and it might start with an informal process of working with the family, which, if that in fact is either inappropriate or breaks down, then moves to the next level of intervention, which would be court. But the creation of an expectation that at the front end, kid and family with state support in services and others, which is what happens in really good diversion programs in Massachusetts right now, but we create that as the formal model of the law, I think would create a much stronger expectation and help to move the early interventions so that everyone agrees that's where we start. If it doesn't work, then we move to court.
I want to pick up on that, but before I do that, I want to remind people, if you're interested in asking a question, now's the time to fill out your index card. If it's directed to a particular panelist, please mark that on the card, and if you could identify yourselves. We'll have people, and just then pass the index cards to the aisles. People will collect them. Thanks. So I want to sort of continue with that line of thought. Sort of two sort of questions, thoughts come to my mind, which is, one, sort of who would take responsibility for doing that work? And this, I think, gets to the question and the point that the Chief Justice raised about sort of early intervention, and at what point would we start doing that? And maybe I'll turn to Chief Justice, since you talked about the importance of early intervention. What would early intervention look like? I mean, for some people, CHINS is seen as early intervention in that it's often the case it occurs before a criminal act has occurred, but we also know that by the time a CHINS petition has been filed, this is not the beginning. It's, things have escalated to a point where, parents, families, feel desperate in some respect. So we've talked about early intervention. What would that look like? When would it occur? And sort of, can you help us think that through?
I think all the panelists have sort of addressed it's not a one-size-fits-all. So it depends on what the community knows about. For instance, there's a lot of activity that goes on in the home that would, under a stranger situation, be characterized as delinquent behavior. Kids who push their mothers, and kids and parents who come in and say, when he swears at me, I don't do anything, but by the time he starts hitting me, I feel I want to come to court. Now, the parent doesn't want that child involved in the criminal justice system. I always want to say, did you think about stopping him when he swore at you? But, it's a very fine line as a judge that you have to walk. If you want parent involvement, participation, and buy into the process, you can't be saying from the bench, you are the rottenest parent I ever saw. I mean, I went to law school, but I have to tell you that half of my job is about parenting and telling a parent how to be a parent, and the level of sort of trying to bridge the gap between saying, you need some strengthening in your parenting. But basically what we're doing is giving the parents, I think what you said, I'm not sure if it was Molly Armstrong that said it, is helping the parents to exercise what their authority should be. So that if I set a curfew on a child, I always say to the kid, don't ask your mother for permission to waive the curfew, and Mom, don't give him permission. We're going to report this to the police, which is a lot easier to do in many of the small communities. We tell when a child's put on a curfew in our court, our probation officers report that to the communities. If that kid is seen out after 9 o'clock, whatever is curfew, probation officer finds out about it, brings the kid back. But we have to empower the parents, because there are so many parents who can't do this. So I always say, there's only one person who can raise this curfew. It's me. And until you're ready to come back to court, don't do it. Or, in many cases, I may give the probation officer the ability to raise the curfew if he's behaving, so that you don't get this power struggle. So you have to acknowledge the child's behavior without criminalizing it, because it's the one thing the parent doesn't want. They want to come in and get help. but they don't want you to then file an assault and battery against the mom, because the parents then don't want to prosecute. They don't want to be in the role of prosecutor, but they want help, and they maybe have done this a little bit too late. And could they go to an agency first? Well, it's not, as I keep saying, it's one size fits all. Sometimes people have gone to the department and they've been involved with the department. Maybe it didn't work. Maybe the resources weren't available. I come from the middle part of the state, and I'm aware of the fact, and now as the chief, I've sat in courts all over the state. And I do that because I want to find out what's available. Well, I can tell you there may be many fewer cases in Athol and Gardiner and Orange, but there are also many fewer resources, and people can't often get to the resources, whereas Boston has a lot of resources thrown at it. I'm not saying that it doesn't need it, but there are, geographically in this state, there are huge inequities, as there are differences in population and geography and resources and all of those things. So sometimes they've gone to the department, but maybe that's been a department that hasn't had many resources, so that then they come to court. Sometimes they come to court first. Sometimes they go to the police, who say, come to court. Some police departments, and I've done training for police departments, say we immediately tell them to go to court. Others say immediately tell them to go to the Department of Social Services. So it's very, very different throughout the state.
Now, let's look at a success. Aubrey is currently a freshman at the Mass College of Art. This is a dream, I think, and a goal she's had for a while that she's been able to pursue recently. So, Aubrey, can you help us understand what made the difference for you? You described some tough times, difficult situations. What made the difference for you?
What made the difference for me? I think it would be having a greater say in placements. The first placements I was put in were terrible. The first real I was put in many different places, like 2 days, 1 day, different places here and there until I could find a bed. But the first placement was just awful. It was so in my opinion, it was emotionally abusive. It was basically a lockdown facility it sounds terrible. I'm sitting, in this place with people who've stolen cars, stolen money, and here I am, I burned a candle in my house and came home at 2 o'clock in the morning, and I'm like, gee, wow, I belong here, I guess. But I think what worked for me was being able to get a quality social worker, which took a little while, and be able to have my voice heard and find a good placement and good places and location, I think, is very important. Being closer to resources, like you were talking about, is very important also. And that's basically what helped me.
That's great. Thanks. Yeah?
I want to tell a couple of success stories, but the Mass College of Art reminded me of one of the most intractable CHINS cases. The child was never placed out of the home, but her behavior and everything about it was troublesome. We could not figure out what was going on. It did not seem to be a troubled family, but her behavior was simply outrageous. And so, as I'm wont to do with kids who seem appropriate, I told her that she needs to do a book report for every day that she missed school, something that I do in truancy cases. And she said, can I draw the report? I said, okay. And her drawings, I who cannot draw a straight line, I have other skills, that drawing's not one of them. And I was so impressed, I asked the probation officer, will you call the Worcester Art Museum? And we arranged for a scholarship for her in high school to go to the Worcester Art Museum. She's now a mentor. She's gone on to college. She went on to the Mass College of Art. I can tell you, for all the cases and the delinquency cases and the troubled children and abused children that we see, I can live for months on that kind of success. And just the other day, I was at the doctor's office, and it was one of those group practices, and a young lady came out of the office, and she hugged me. She said, Judge Grace, do you remember me? She's now 22 years old. I had her when she was at CHINS. She was 16. She had 2 children. And she was brilliant. And she was capable of so much. She was, in fact, had become sort of the brains behind this drug group of people who were much older than she. And we kept working with her. She didn't ultimately get any delinquencies herself, but she kept falling away and not going to school. And she said, do you still have the programs that you sent me to, because I want to go and talk to the other kids. She said, I would not tell them. She said, I love my children. They're now 7 and 8 years old, and she's 22 years old. She said, I wouldn't trade them for the world, but I would never have a child again. And she said, I absolutely couldn't have done it if the people in the court hadn't kept supporting me. She is finishing her nursing degree. She's gotten her associate's degree, and she is on her way to a BA, and she's working in a doctor's office. So, I mean, those are the success stories, and there are lots of them. It's not a perfect system. I would never claim to anybody here that we have a perfect system, but a lot of the things do work, and those are the things that keep us going.
Officer Grice, if you want to jump in, I also have a question for you as well. I think we've all sort of talked, the issue of resources has come up, and it's clear if you're going to provide services and ample, that more resources are needed. They're always an issue in doing this kind of work. I'd also be curious to hear, though, besides resources, we can sort of acknowledge that that's part of the issue, but besides resources, what else do you think is needed to effectively implement the law?
I think one thing is the empowerment of parents. I think that the collaboration of family is very, very important. Sometimes as officers we see, you can go in the home and sometimes tell directly what the issue is as soon as you walk through the door. And other times you can't. And even now, dealing with young women, they're not the ones robbing the banks. They're not the ones involved in a lot of the gang fights. A little cat fight sometimes that happen primarily around a lot of young females. But most of the times when they come in contact with us, it's because of CHINS, the CHINS warrants that have been placed on them. So that it opens up just a partnership. And just a quick story. I remember one time we did a home visit with a young lady, and the young girl really was really out of control in the home. She wasn't listening to her mother. She wasn't going to school. I guess she had met this young man that was really distracting her. We did a visit to her, and she did have a CHINS issued on her that allowed a lot of the resources to come in the home. But what it also allowed is the mother to have a little bit more control, just to say, if you don't do this, this can happen to you. And then to have officers and other individuals that are involved with the process to come in and reinforce that and to support the parent. This young lady's involved in a dance program in New York now, and she's doing wonderful. A couple of months ago, her mother sent me a bouquet of roses to the office, which was tremendous. So, like you said, for every issue that you have that didn't work, there's a few of them that just stand out. There's another issue I remember dealing with about a home of 3 young ladies, and one of the young ladies was pregnant. But still involved in the CHINS process, and her cousins were living in the home with her, also involved in the CHINS process. Again, I think it allowed the mother to have a support and kind of and empowered her to let her know that, look, if you guys don't do the right things, this can happen to you. Again, to be reinforced with the law enforcement community and the other resources within the community. I think that family, I visited them again a couple of weeks ago, doing tremendous. The young lady did have her baby. Unfortunately, that was a stumbling block, but she is continuing her education. And they do realize that Boston's kind of it's different. It's different. I travel a lot of different other cities and dealing with young people in crime. And Boston, as far as the partnerships and empowering the parents and the family, I think that's tremendous here.
Before we get to the questions, I'd like to sort of go down the line of panelists and include Molly, if you're willing, and sort of say what's the most important thing we could do tomorrow to improve the situation.
Take your experience with partnerships, and I think what everyone has alluded to is the more you can put it on the front end. It doesn't actually take a change in the law to make a change in the system, and screen the cases. I think part of the judges, not saying Judge Grace necessarily, but judges' frustrations is they feel they end up being the backstop. And so I think there are things you could do right on the front end with the resources that you have, and take advantage of the long history of partnerships that you have here.
Aubrey?
I think the only advice I can think of right now would be to look into what people are doing, how people are doing their jobs, and what people are actually doing in the system to make it the most effective as it can be. If people aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing, or if they're doing things incorrectly or whatever, then it needs to be changed. Because I think people start learning what they're, supposed to be, what they're being paid to do, then the system probably would work a lot better.
I think what these first two people have said is, let's build on what we have. Let's reassess the system and say what's working about it. What are the strength-based systems that we have? Let's try to fix what's not working, but there are an enormous number of strengths that we have. We have a long partnership. The Commissioner and I meet with groups of people, meet individually. We agree on many things, and we can reasonably agree to disagree on that, but we can at least talk to the strengths that we have. One thing, listening to Aubrey today reminds me that when I've got a CHINS case in front of them, I'm going to be much more careful about explaining to the mother and the child exactly what a CHINS case is, what is going to happen, what could happen. Because I mean, when you live in the world of legalese, we talk in legalese, we talk about ABDWs, and we just assume everybody knows what that means. And everybody doesn't know what the legalese is, so this was a good reminder that we need to be much more focused. When we're all in the same kind of field, we talk in a language, and not everybody coming in for the first time understands that.
I think there are two possibilities, and I'm of two minds about how best we should proceed. One possibility is to say, well, it may not be a very clear law, it may be a confused law, but it doesn't prevent good things from happening. Let's just focus administratively on trying to proliferate good practice across the state. I frankly fear that 10 years from now, the result of that approach will be some modest improvement, but it will be marginal, is my guess. I would argue that that if we really want to build, more important than the structure, if we want to build a profound consensus among the adults who are engaged with these families and children across the state about what in fact constitutes the best approach, and we want to build that practice so that we don't have to send out missionaries town by town, but instead so that there is a culture across those agencies, those adults that are responsible for this, that in fact re-examining the law collaboratively together and then agreeing that the law might codify best practice is an opportunity to build a broad consensus. Frankly, more importantly than the change in the law would be the possibility then that we wouldn't just have a model program here and a model program there and a model program somewhere else, but that we might get beyond the point of pilots that it seems to me so burdens our work to improve work with kids. We proliferate pilots and never then learn and generalize. So I would argue for the addressing the statute as a way less of, yes, it changes the law if it works well. But what really happens is all the adults reach some profound agreement about how we want this system to work. I think that would be far more fruitful and hopeful for how we might move forward than our continuing with the pilot work that we've done for years.
To pick up on that, the one group of adults who we need to get agreement on how the system should work is actually probation officers, and we haven't talked about probation, the role of probation here today. Most of the children who are going to be involved in CHINS cases are going to spend a great deal of time working with probation officers, and so that's a piece that needs to be addressed. They need training. They need to know that they need low case. Frankly, caseloads can be too high. They need to have caseloads that allow them to not just monitor kids, but to actually help kids, because they're actually the first line of defense. The lawyers go away, the judges go away, and hopefully DSS is not involved. And so the first line here is with probation, and even without changing the statute, we could do much better to help probation help these children.
Yeah, I just want to interject a statistic. Some of the data I saw actually suggested that CHINS cases can be as much as half of a probation officer's caseload. That's very high. You should just know that's very, very high. And that's something to really think about as you look at your system.
There's a hiring freeze in the trial court. There's a hiring freeze in the Department of Social Services. I mean, those are the realities. I think everybody.
Let's let Officer Grice finish.
Well, I was just going to say another point we could do is educate the law enforcement officers, the first responders, to exactly what CHINS is and the benefits of CHINS. I think, again, like I spoke earlier, there's definitely a stereotype associated with CHINS. I think more education to the linemen, officers, and the collaborations that CHINS can offer would be a good resource.
If I could just add one note, what concerns me is this. I actually think, and I understand, we talk about training and education, but I think what really happens in this system is there are a vast array of views and values by the people who participate in making this system work. A vast array of perspectives and views and values. And because it's a confused law, people can hold on to their particular perspectives and apply them. So we heard Aubrey's story, right? I mean, there were just a lot of different people who basically had a lot of different values about how this ought to be dealt with. And until Aubrey finally found someone whose values made sense for helping her with her life, it didn't work. So part of the problem is, I think, is that if we do the pilots, it means that all of those who are already, we simply convert the converted. All of those who already share the kinds of values we're talking about will do it. And all of those who don't, won't. So the value of a larger process, and it seems to me a focus around the law as a way to kind of galvanize this, really gets us as a community into a deep discussion about those values. And gets those outliers who don't agree, who may not be outliers, who may be very substantial, whether they're my social workers or probation officers or whatever, gets us all in a room, basically, and says, we've got to reach some real agreement here. We can't have this random system that all depends on who you happen to bump into. And if you're lucky, you're in a community with good diversion programs, and if you're not, you get a different treatment. We would build some consensus around values, core values, and there'll always be some dissenters, but at least there would be, again, a clear shared expectation of how this best works.
Nobody actually mentioned something that has been mentioned earlier, though, that we need some data collection. I think we would all agree that we need good data to find out what this population is.
You won't hear objections from me on that one. Now we have time for a few questions. First to Judge Grace. This is from Amy Cobb of the Suffolk County DA's office. And she asks, could you comment on how community-based juvenile justice roundtables play a role in increasing interagency communication? How could CBJJ play a role in improving the efficacy of CHINS? Thank you.
Well, those of you who know what's been going on over the past few years know how sort of a hot-button topic this is. There's been information-sharing legislation filed by the District Attorneys Association for the past 4 years. And it is not that I'm opposed to agencies sharing information, but it needs to be in a controlled way. One of my first objections to the original legislation was that it held a mandate that probation officers shall report all arraignments on everything to the school departments. And my response was, if that happens, the kid who's kind of a pain in the neck, the CHINS kid, who should be in school but picked up a delinquency in the form of a trespassing or a delinquency, shoplifting, the school might use that as an excuse to get him out without a safety hearing. I have no problem with the law that says upon a conviction, the school's entitled to no conviction on a felony. That works, and it should work. But we need to know what kinds of behaviors make the school safe or unsafe. So I was concerned about that aspect of the information sharing bill. The second thing is that a lot of people were sitting around the table, and the parent wasn't being invited. And I said the parent needs to be invited to the table. And the response that I got was, well, if we invite the parents to the table, half of the time they're part of the problem. Okay, but you're not going to get you're not going to make a plan for this kid in that community without parental buy-in. And why don't we make the presumption different? Why don't we say the parent shall be invited unless we determine that the parent's so much a part of the problem that we can't work with the parent, and then decide to exclude the parent. I have to tell you, and for all of you who are parents or have been parents of teenagers, I don't want that round table talking about my kid and expect me to talk about it if I'm not at the table, however poor my behavior is. It just may be that I'll change after I sit there. So I'm happy. I mean, I've been very public on this issue of information sharing. It's not that I don't think that there are times and places for sharing information. I just want to make sure that it's done. I have sat in communities where the information shared was used for the sole purpose of getting the kid out of school in inappropriate circumstances. Now, places like Boston, Springfield, Worcester, I think Essex County have committed to alternative placements. So the kid that doesn't belong in the school can be placed in an alternative placement. For all of the rest of the hundreds of small communities where that information is used to remove a kid from school, you can make a school safety argument, but you can't make a public safety argument for the kid who belongs in school, but at 10:30 in the morning he's out at the mall shoplifting, because there's no supervision to him. I mean, I have been at the table. I'm willing to discuss things. One of the other issues that came up was around the release of court clinic records. Around mental health still carries a big stigma to it. I don't think that a lot of these people would want their court clinic records shared with everybody, and it becomes an access issue based on economics. I am in a position that if my child needs the help of a mental health professional, I'm going to go out and hire my own. And that report remains with me. I do not have to share it with anybody because I can pay for it. There should not be a different system for the child who cannot afford that, or the family who doesn't have the resources and goes to the court clinic. You can tell I haven't thought about this.
Commissioner Spence, this is from Representative Kay Kahn. What planning is the administration doing for both today and for the future to respond to the lack of services for CHINS as described by Judge Grace, particularly related to mental illness?
Well, I think, is this on? I think, first of all, I'd have to say, obviously, the question of lack of resources is, we all agree is an extraordinarily difficult one at this moment, because our expectations for the possibility of increasing resources in the near future are slim, to say the least. The 05 budget looks worse. I think there are two things going on. One certainly is the Commission on Children's Mental Health that was established a year and a half ago. That is trying to drive at this question of where are we failing to provide appropriate mental health services. And I say that I think the child welfare system and the children's mental health system are kind of a continuum and overlap in huge ways. So that's addressed at us as well as the department. But I think everybody's focus right now is less on the question of, let's go demand more money, because I think that feels fruitless. It's rather, where are we applying our resources, and is that the right place to be applying them? Does it make sense to have 1,000 CHINS kids for an average of 2.5 years at $65,000 a year in residential? Or is that $65 million a year more than twice, in fact 3 times, almost 3 times the amount of money we spend on all of our family support work in the entire state for 30,000 families? Does it make sense to spend $65 million on those kids? Is that the best use of resources for the support of those kids? If all of them have to be in residential, the answer is yes. But if, in fact, we could have applied those resources far more effectively earlier on in a family prevention model with support to the family at 1/10 of the cost, we could serve vastly more kids if we could reduce by 1/4 the number of kids in residential. That would be a wonderful thing. So I think my own response basically is, I think the issue is at this moment the misapplication of resources. When we start applying them correctly, we'll know whether we have enough. I can't tell right now. If we start applying them better, we can begin to judge whether, in fact, we've got enough. I know they're seriously misapplied now.
Can I just, another plug for the data issue. So, for example, we took a look at a couple of populations in placement, and we looked at kids who came in New York City on truancy petitions and who were placed. And we found that they went to school less often after they were placed. And if you think about that, it kind of makes sense, right? If a kid was having trouble going to school and it was a few blocks away, and now you necessarily have to place them maybe many miles away from their original school, maybe you have to get them into a new school, and that's not an easy thing to do, those of you in the audience who tried to do that. So we weren't meeting the needs in that particular case. And the same thing actually with the runaway population. Incredibly high, not shocking, AWOL rates. Interesting thing, a lot of them ran home. So maybe they could have gone home. So,
to add to that, I was recently at a discussion, and wherever I speak, the school departments will come up and say, when you commit a kid to the custody of the department and they remove the child, why don't they look for a place in the child's school setting? If the child is doing well in school, why do we take him out of that school setting and place him someplace else? Therapists have done the same thing. You remove him from a particular area and move him to another part of the state, he loses or she loses the therapeutic relationship. And so it's a discussion to have with the commissioner and the line social workers and say, maybe we take a look at what is the priority? Where is the child doing well? Are they doing well in school? Have they got a good therapeutic relationship? Let's make that the priority and either try to have them stay at home or try to do a short-term placement so that those things that are doing well can continue.
Great. We have a lot of other questions.
A very quick note.
Okay, I'm going to then...
One piece of data.
Okay.
2 child welfare systems that have been reformed immensely in the last 10 years, Illinois and New York City. In both cases, hugely successful reforms. They reduced removals by over 50% in both cases. Poorly administered child welfare programs manage both not to reduce danger for kids and to take far too many away.
A good note to end the panel discussion on. There are a lot of other questions. I'm sorry that we've run out of time, and I do want to turn it over to Tom Corey, who's going to do his best to sort of wrap up what we've talked about today and what we've learned.
Thanks, Dana. At the risk of keeping people here a little longer, I guess it's popular to be a closer in Boston these days, so 4 weeks ago we couldn't say that, but I guess we can say that now. I'm just going to make a couple of observations because there's a tremendous amount of collective wisdom on this panel. More so, with all due respect to the panel, I can look out at this audience in my 20 years or so in this business. There's a tremendous amount of collective wisdom in this audience, and I wish all of you could have had the opportunity to share your insights and thoughts. Just share with you my own experience. 15 years in the philanthropy business and 20 years in the criminal justice business. My first 10 years in philanthropy, I still couldn't understand whether CHINS was a criminal problem or a social service problem. And I'll be honest with you, I'm still not sure I know the difference. I have my own thoughts, and Molly, and let me just share with you in closing a couple of observations. Molly made a statement about how famous Massachusetts is for our partnerships, and I will agree with that. We're also famous for some other things called turf battles and turf issues. Where does one's responsibility begin? Where does one's responsibility end? And I think we still haven't resolved that problem in this state, and I think until we do, we're not going to make much progress on a lot of issues, including how do we make CHINS better. Aubrey, thank you so much for your comments. I think you touched on the issue of the tendency sometimes to criminalize CHINS, which I think is a real problem for families and for kids. With all due respect to the courts, and I think they've done a wonderful job. They have a tremendous role and responsibility to play in CHINS, but I've always been of the thought that the court is the last place we want to be to resolve these kinds of issues. That every step has to be taken to resolve them before they get to the courts, because once they reach the courts, it does, no matter how hard we try, it does become a criminal problem. I made some notes, but my 57 years old, along with Harry Spence, in no glasses, it's getting trouble, a little trouble. I want to touch on what Harry said about the two tracks one we can take to deal with this issue. One is continuing with the wonderful pilots, which feeds into what Judge Grace said about if you're in Athol or Fitchburg and Leominster, what do? You may have all the wonderful, you may be of well thoughts and want to do the right thing, but you're in an area where the resources don't exist. So, and he also mentioned about the bigger picture. We need to get all of our wonderful thinking people here in Massachusetts together to look at the big picture and to codify changes so that when wonderful people like Judge Grace and Harry Spence have gone to other places, we have something in place. So I think we need to do both. I don't think it's one or the other. I think that we need to continue to pilot good programs because we feed on that, and it does have a tremendous role to play. But I also think we need to look at the big picture. What I would say in terms of the big picture is nothing changes in this state without a champion. And so someone needs to champion this cause. I used to think the champion needed to come from the public sector, but I'm not convinced of that anymore. I think maybe the champions for changing the system can come from the private sector. So the question is, how do we do that? I don't have the answer. All I can say is nothing really changes until you have someone stand up, and someone of substance, whether it's an organization, a group of organizations, and becomes a champion for a cause and moves reform. So I think that absolutely needs to happen. On that note, go Red Sox. Let's cheer.